Hi class, so this week we're covering chapter 6, Qualitative Research. So the objectives for this week is to describe the differences between qualitative and quantitative research, discuss strengths and limitations of qualitative research and for what types of research questions such methods are appropriate, articulate how qualitative research can augment quantitative research and vice versa, describe methods of collecting data in qualitative research, and also discuss case study qualitative research method. So qualitative method stems from the interpretive or narrative tradition, and what qualitative methods does is that it tries to understand deeper meanings of human experience. So meaning is generally best captured with words and images when we're looking at qualitative research rather than using numbers or counting things like we do in quantitative research. It is also highly applicable to our social work field because it provides more information on people's lives and what it's like for them to experience a certain phenomena. So we get a deeper understanding of what the client is experiencing. So here's a comparison of quantitative and qualitative research results. So looking at the quantitative methods, this is the one where we use numbers, statistics, and so we may have a question on a research survey like, what is your level of agreement with the following statement? Okay, and so we would give them a statement. The statement could say something like this: it is difficult to cope with chronic illness. And then we give them choices from 1 to 5, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And so the participants would just select whichever one best fits them in responding to that specific statement. And so whenever we collect the data from something like this, we would write up results like 85% of the sample age 80 and over strongly agree that it is difficult to cope with chronic illness. So with quantitative, we are looking at numbers and we try to come up with percentages to describe the sample and to describe what's going on. With the qualitative method, look at the difference. Look how their response is, or the written results is so much more than when you do it with quantitative, right? So a response in the qualitative method would look like this. When you look at that, look how much more deeper meaning you got, right? It's like they gave you so much information. And if you had just asked a quantitative question, well, you definitely would not get that level of information. So qualitative methods is something that you would use when it's exploratory, you don't have much information on the topic, and you really need to get more of a more deeper understanding of what the client is experiencing. So for example, if you wanted to know someone's personal experience with something, then you would rather use a qualitative method than use a quantitative method. You would want to let them tell you the story, let them explain to you what they're experiencing. So in looking at a quantitative research question, you might compare the outcomes of an intervention for two different groups. However, looking at a qualitative research question, you might focus it more on participants' perceptions about something, their impressions, or their experiences of involvement in one of the groups. So you see the difference? In quantitative, we're comparing their outcomes on the intervention. However, in qualitative, we're looking more on their perceptions. How do they feel about the intervention, or what's their impression, or what is their experiences with the intervention? So we would just pick one of the group and get more information on that one group. So here's another example comparing the two different types of research in using research questions. So with the quantitative question, it would be something like this. Do clients who complete 8 solution-focused therapy sessions report fewer problematic symptoms than clients who complete 8 motivational interviewing therapy sessions? So here we're looking at whether there's a difference for those who take solution-focused therapy session versus those who take motivation interview therapy sessions. With the qualitative question, it would be something like this. What is it like to experience solution-focused therapy? How do clients describe their emotional status after completing 8 motivational interview therapy sessions? So again, do you see the difference? With quantitative, we're more looking at whether there were less problematic symptoms from using one therapy versus the other. With qualitative, we're looking into more of their experience. What was their experience in using that therapy? Or how did they describe their emotional status after using the therapy? So different reasons why you would use one over the other. So here are 5 reasons for using qualitative methods. So when very little is known about a topic and initial exploration is needed to even start a study or to even know what to do a study on. When understanding is sought regarding a complex situation that is constantly changing. So if you're trying to understand something that is very complex and something that's constantly changing, when there's interest in studying participants' reaction in their natural setting or process to determine their experiences of it, the meaning they ascribe to it, and their interpretation of it. So if you're looking to study people's reaction when they're in their natural setting and how they describe their experiences of it, what does it mean to them, and how do they interpret it, that's when you would use qualitative as well. When the goal is to develop new exploratory theory that is grounded in reality or the lived experience. So again, when something is complicated, complex, constantly changing, you need a deeper understanding of it, you would use qualitative methods. So some strengths of qualitative research. Well, they generate a rich understanding of the topic that you're trying to study and the lived experience that really you can't get those responses from a quantitative method study. It's also highly flexible because data collection is ongoing, and with qualitative, not only is the data collection ongoing, but it also happens simultaneously with data analysis, allowing the research plan to be altered as needed. So when you do qualitative methods, you're collecting data, but as you're getting that data, you're also analyzing the results at the same time. So therefore, you can look at the data you're getting and you can adjust or alter the research plan if you need to do that. With quantitative studies, you don't do that. So with quantitative, you don't analyze the data until all the data is collected. Qualitative study can also be less expensive than when you use quantitative. Along with the strengths, there's also some criticisms of qualitative research. So qualitative research lacks generalizability. The findings are so in-depth and so specific to the sample at hand. So for example, usually when you're doing qualitative studies, you're trying to understand the lived experience of someone and you're trying to get a deeper understanding. And so a lot of times the data that you're collecting is so in-depth and so specific, and therefore you can't really generalize it to another population. However, findings tell us what experiences can be like for some people. So even though we can't generalize it to a larger group, the data that we do collect, the findings that we do get, really tell us what those experiences may be like for some people. And what you can do with that is you can take that and then you can create a quantitative study to be able to get a larger sample and where you could generalize the data. Subjectivity is another criticism. So the results are frequently based on the researcher's interpretation or judgment, which are influenced by his or her values and individual biases. So with subjectivity, basically what it's saying is that as a researcher, we are interpreting those results and we are judging that result based on the individual researcher. And so it can be influenced by specific biases or individual values that the researcher may have. And so with qualitative, it's very subjective. Quantitative is more objective. But steps can be taken to minimize bias. And with subjectivity, when you're doing qualitative, you can do some other things in terms of minimizing those biases by maybe doing triangulation of the data, where you can have different researchers look at the data, and then if three different people look at the data and come up with the same interpretation, then that also reduces the bias and reduces the subjectivity. So how do qualitative and quantitative methods differ? They can differ by their research aims. So with qualitative research, it seeks to develop a rich understanding of some aspect of human experience. Generalizability is definitely not a goal in qualitative research. When it comes to quantitative, they're not really trying to develop a rich understanding of some aspect of human experience, and they're definitely generalizing the data. Sample sizes are smaller in qualitative studies. Saturation is the goal rather than generalizability. And saturation is basically when no new information emerges through data collection efforts. So if you are doing a qualitative study and you're collecting data from people, right? You have a participant, and let's say you get to about participant 4 or 5, and you notice that you're not getting any new information other than what the other 4 participants have told you, then that means that you've reached saturation. So you're not getting any more new information, and so you could end the study there. So sample sizes are small with qualitative. Quantitative, you have to have like a much larger sample sizes. While the goal of quantitative research is generalizability, the goal of qualitative research is saturation. Sampling strategies are also different. Purposive samples are used in qualitative research to maximize the variability of the data. And so whenever you're doing a qualitative study, you're purposely selecting your sample. There's a purpose as to why those people would be in your study. So when it comes to data collection, here are some methods that you can use in qualitative research. You can do individual interviews, focus groups, observation, and review of existing records. So with individual interviews, the questions may revolve around how people experience being part of a cultural group or a subculture. It can be on how they describe or comprehend an experience or an event, and the discovery of regularities and patterns in people's experiences. So whenever you're doing your interviews, they would probably revolve around these things. So when it comes to qualitative research using individual interviews, the questions won't ask participants to select predefined responses. So when it comes to open or unstructured interviews, basically it's free flowing. You would ask a question, you would just allow the participants to just tell you their answer. So whatever they want to share based on what you ask, they're free to do that. You're not trying to guide them in any way at this point. So with the semi-structured, you do have a list of some questions that you want to ask, and it allows the interviewer to modify the sequences and wording of questions to fit each participant during those interviews. We can also have standardized open-ended interviews, and these consist of pre-developed questions that are worded exactly how they need to be asked. Here, you also have specific probes and may be asked if needed at the key points. So basically a probe is whenever you ask a specific question, depending on the answer that the participant gives you, then you would be able to probe them for more information. So let's say you ask an open-ended question and the participant gave you a broad answer, but you needed them to be a little bit more specific, or they mentioned something, but it's so broad that it can mean so many different things. You can probe them into saying, tell me a little bit more about this. And then they would give you more information about that specific thing. With informal conversations, this is a spontaneous interaction between the interviewer and the respondent, and this usually occurs naturally in an unplanned way during a field observation. Here's an example of a standardized open-ended interview schedule. This is standardized. That means you would have to read the questions exactly the way it is. So the first one would be, what has been your role in the incident? What has happened since the event that you have been involved in? What has been the effect of the university community of the incident? So you would read it word for word. You wouldn't change anything about it. Then you have focus groups. So with a focus group, this is the group interview method using a skilled moderator who interviews about 5 to 10 people. And this is usually done in an environment that is conducive to sharing information. So I'm not sure how many of you have participated in focus groups before. I think I've participated in at least about two. And so with interviews, the questions are carefully predetermined, and the moderator has a great deal of flexibility in asking follow-up questions and providing clarification and prompts. So with the focus groups, the questions are already predetermined. However, the moderator has that flexibility to ask follow-up questions. And since it's in a group setting and you may get a response from a participant, as the moderator, you can ask follow-up questions to get clarification or to get more information about something new that they mentioned or something that you don't have information on. These usually include 7 to 10 questions, and they're open-ended. They follow a logical sequence from general to more specific. So you would start off with general questions and then get more specific. They're usually exploratory in nature, and they can deal with things like feelings, attitudes, experiences, and knowledge. So given the public nature of the discussion, focus groups are usually not appropriate for research related to sensitive topics. So depending on your topic, you may not be able to use focus groups. So if you're discussing something very sensitive, because this is done in a group setting, you would not be able to use focus group. So it just depends on your topic as to whether you would want to do individual interviews or you want to do focus groups or any other of the methods we're going to discuss. Here's also a sample on the focus group questions that was used for a community needs assessment. So the first question the researcher may have asked is, where is everyone from? Just to try to get general information. They were from Green Court, so they asked, how long have you been in Green Court? Just to kind of get the conversation started. And then the next question was, what brought you to Green Court, right? And then what is it like for a person who is homeless in Green Court? And as you can see how the questions are being asked, they also had some follow-up. Can you compare it to homeless life in other places? And things like that. So here's just an example of what a focus group questionnaire would look like for a community needs assessment. As you can see, they're general questions, and it's nothing sensitive, as you can see. And as you can see with question 5, for example, do you have any needs that are not being met? And so like people start mentioning what those needs are. They follow up by saying prioritize top 3 of those needs, right? What are your top 3? To get more specific as to, what are the most, I guess, popular needs. Observation is another form of qualitative research method in terms of collecting your data. You can have pure observation where the observer remains apart from the group, event, or person being observed. So with pure observation, the researcher stays away from the person or group or event observed. It is appropriate for use with nonverbal populations. It's useful for studying behaviors across contexts and also when it's highly structured. So if you have a limited number of defined behaviors that are being observed within a specified time frame and location, you would do pure observation. Behaviors observed in terms of 3 characteristics would be the frequency of the behavior, the duration of the behavior, and then the magnitude or intensity of the behavior. Remember, we talked about those 3 things when we were talking about single systems design. Then you can also have participant observation. So with participant observation, the observer becomes actively involved in the research setting. So with pure observation, the researcher is unengaged and not actively involved at all with the participant. However, with participant observation, the researcher becomes actively involved in the research setting, and they make use of interviews that vary across participants depending on the topics of discussion. Another way for using qualitative data collection is also by using review of existing records. So paper and electronic documents, you can have databases or any other non-document artifacts of human behavior are usually included in existing records. Existing documents are valuable sources of information for social work researchers. Again, if you already have existing records, a lot of times you can use those. So use existing records to answer the question, what are the similarities and differences in how home health social workers describe terminally ill clients relative to non-terminally ill clients in psychosocial assessments? So again, what do you think the existing record would be here? Psychosocial assessments, right? A lot of agencies collect those on their clients. And so if you were trying to do a research study on the similarities and differences of how home health social workers describe their terminally ill clients in relation to their non-terminally ill, you can definitely use their psychosocial assessments. That's what we call existing records as well. So sampling in qualitative research. So qualitative research employs non-probability or purposive sampling strategies. They have a specific purpose, and so they purposely pick the participants in the study. The goal is to create samples that are likely to yield rich knowledge regarding the phenomenon of interest. When selecting the sample in qualitative study, you're purposely picking people who's going to give you knowledge on a specific topic that you're studying. Qualitative researchers intentionally select the elements to be included in the sample. So they may choose elements believed to be good sources of information, possess varied perspective on common experiences, or are also extreme or deviant cases. Here are some examples of qualitative sampling strategies. Snowball sampling. So the researchers asked the initial participants to identify other potential participants. So with snowball sampling, you would use this with participants that are hard to locate or hard to access. So for example, like the homeless population. So the way snowball sampling works is that you would have a participant who fits the research study, who's a potential participant, and they may do the interview, or you would ask them the questions that you're trying to do for your study, and then you would ask them, if you know someone else who's eligible for this study, can you give them the information? And so that person will tell the other person tells the other person, and it's like a snowball effect. So that's how the snowball sampling works. So with the deviant cases sampling, these focuses on cases that usually don't fit the pattern. So meaning that they're an extreme case. They're not generally what you would expect. Quota sampling applies to populations that have distinct categories of membership or participation. So it aims to ensure that all subgroups of the larger population are studied. So you have a quota, a certain number that you need to have. So how to draw a quota sample? Well, you need to identify key variables and establish discrete categories. So what key variables are you looking for? What do these participants need to have? You need to determine the representation of each category in the population based on prior knowledge. So based on what you already know about this population, determine what each category needs to have, and then establish the desired sample size, calculate the quotas, and then sample using convenience or snowball sampling until you fill the quotas. So convenience sample is when you just use participants that are available. So for example, college students are a convenient sample because it's easy to get access to college students if you are a professor. So gatekeepers may be necessary to allow researchers to gain access to the population of interest. So this is known as gaining entry and also involves process of building trust. So gatekeepers are those people who help researchers gain access to the population that they are trying to study. However, gatekeepers have to be convinced that the research will provide or produce more benefit than harm. The participants' right will not be violated. Also, that the research will be sensitive to the participants' needs and preferences, and that the researcher has the adequate skills and resources to carry out the research that they're trying to do. These are the common qualitative methods. However, we're going to only focus on case study because that's probably the most common one. And as a social worker, especially for people who don't do a lot of research, you're probably, if you do any, you'd probably do a case study. So with the case study, this is the type of research that you can do with your individual clients. And so it's highly likely that this is the one that you would most likely use. So with the case study, it develops understanding of a phenomenon through in-depth analysis of one or few single case examples. So again, you can use this with an individual client, with an individual family, with an individual community, an individual organization. So the focus of case study is just to understand one individual case. So case studies focus on discovering key system elements such as their history, motivation, and worldview, as well as deriving patterns and processes that can explain how the system functions. Case studies appear in the form of narratives of events and descriptions of personalities and situations. So in social work research, case studies often center on individuals or families who seek social work services and document their background, their history, environmental context, and reasons for seeking those services. Case studies also help social workers develop empathy by encouraging them to see the world from perspectives of the person or people being studied. A case study also documents the process of the intervention by using detailed notes and recordings to keep a record of services and also to hypothesize the reasons why interventions are or are not effective. The goal is to understand the person or his environment in order to increase understanding of human behavior and to help develop effective interventions. Social work researchers can also use case studies for exploratory research when they know very little about the phenomenon. A researcher might, for example, use a case study to understand the experiences of throwaway teens. So homeless teenagers who have been forced to leave home by parents or caregivers. The researcher's goal would be to obtain an in-depth understanding of the motivations, lifestyles, and consequences of being a throwaway teen and the culture in which the phenomenon exists. The researcher would study one teen or a few teens in this situation and attempt to understand his or her worldview, their needs, motivations, and social niche. This effort might involve in-depth interviews with the teen's family, friends, and acquaintances, their neighbors, schools and medical personnel, and the police. So, in addition, the researcher would carefully document relevant treatment strategies and issues, including engagement strategies, background assessment, and successes and failures. From the cumulative data, the researcher might also develop and test a theory of throwaway teens. So in this context, it would be possible to use a case study for explanatory research as well, with the goal to establish cause and effect processes and to explain the reasons why things happen the way they do. So social workers could use this material to increase their understanding and empathy for these teens and to inform intervention efforts and to provide information that might be useful in prevention campaigns. So as you can see, case study has a lot of benefit and it can be very useful in getting more information about a specific case or a specific client. And as you can see, it can be very useful for social workers to use in any agency. So qualitative data analysis typically involves the analysis of words, whether they're letters, spoken and recorded words from your interviews, or observational notes. Qualitative data is also very lengthy. For example, just one 60-minute interview can have as much as about 20 pages of text. Qualitative data analysis is the process that includes data collection, concurrent data analysis, and purposive collection of additional data. So you might be collecting data and analyzing the data at the same time and realize that you may need additional information, and so you can do that at the same time as well. So if you notice, oh wait, I need more information about this specific question, or I didn't get as much on this question, you can also collect additional information. There is no one right way to analyze qualitative data. So the major systematic steps in analyzing qualitative data is, first you want to prepare the data, organize the data into concepts, develop your story, maximizing your rigor by validating conclusions, and final steps, reporting the findings. Preparing your data. You have to plan for a ratio of approximately about 1 to 3. So 1 hour of recording will require about 3 hours of transcription. You must review and edit the transcript for errors. You need a budget for cost of transcription and associated equipment. So if you're paying someone to transcribe for you, then you may need the budget for that. Or if you have to buy or rent equipment to do it as well. And as you can see, 1 hour of recording may take you up to 3 hours to transcribe. So again, very lengthy, very time consuming. Labeling different types of information. So you need to label what was said, what was observed, and the researcher's thoughts and reflections. Then you decide on the use of computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software. So you need to decide what software you're going to use. Then you organize your data into concepts. So first, what you need to do is read through the entire collection of data, including your research notes. Then you can begin your data reduction. So here is where you set aside data that may have nothing to do with the research question that you're trying to answer, or is not really relevant. So a lot of times in qualitative research, participants give you so much information, and so a lot of times it may be off topic, and a lot of times it may not directly relate to what you're trying to answer, and so you have to weed all that information out, and that's what we call data reduction. So next, you want to begin to identify concepts in the data and fit them into categories. So here's what you may look at. You may find different themes in the data, and you may separate them into categories. Then you begin coding the data. So theoretical coding is when the researcher has an underlying theory in mind regarding the themes they find in the data. Open coding is when the researcher does not assume any underlying theme ahead of time, and so categories are allowed to emerge from the data itself. So coding also involves marking portions of the text, including the notes, with labels to indicate data that fit with the identified categories. So next to the indicated words or sentences, you can write brief comments that provide insight into the importance of those elements. You also want to keep a running log of in-depth thoughts, concerns, questions, and ideas about certain concepts that stand out during the coding process. This is what we call memoing. And you want to be aware of both the ethic and emic perspectives while coding. So the ethic is the researcher's perspective, and the emic is the participant's perspective in qualitative analysis. So you need to be careful and be aware of which one is the researcher versus the participant's perspective while you're coding the data. In developing the story, so when coding, you need to constantly question how the emerging patterns or themes in the data relate to the initial research question. So as you're coding, constantly ask yourself that question, how those patterns relate to your question. Look for any deviations from the theme in the data, areas of disagreement and contrast. You also need to search to identify factors that can help explain the deviations. This may mean returning to the field for additional data collection. So basically, you need to identify factors that can explain why there's so much deviation from the data. And so one way to do that is maybe going back to the participants and asking them additional questions. A helpful tool in moving from data coding to the development of conclusion is to organize the categories, themes, and patterns into data displays. So the data displays can take many different forms, but their basic purpose is to help the researcher describe and explain visually how the concepts in the data are linked. So here's an example of a data display. It's called a concept map. And here they're looking at the relationships among social workers' evaluation of their professional role. And basically, you're just showing a display of how different things are linked. So looking at the top, we have professional worth and professionalism. And then professional worth is also linked to effective use of expertise, value, and respect. And then effective use of expertise is related or linked to their workload. Their workload is linked to paperwork, direct client contact, and there's also a link between the paperwork and the direct client contact. And then as you can see, direct client contact is linked to their value, which is also linked to effective use of expertise and respect. So it just basically shows how the data is related. All right, so maximizing rigor by validating conclusions. This involves judging whether the conclusions that have emerged from the analysis are credible, defensible, and able to withstand alternative explanations. So there are 5 methods for you to do that: triangulation, respondent validation, an explicit account of the data collection and analysis methods, reflexivity, and attention to negative cases. So triangulations make comparisons among the results from different methods of data collection or different sources. For example, the researcher could compare the results obtained from observations to those obtained from interviews. Similarly, they could also compare the results from a group of homeless individuals to the accounts of staff members of the homeless shelters. Respondent validation is reviewing the results of the data analysis with the participants of the research. It is also referred to as what we call member checking. So you are going back to the participants and saying, this is what I interpreted, this is what I got from that, is that correct? An explicit account of the data collection and analysis methods. This provides a clear description of how the data were collected and analyzed. So it allows other researchers to validate the claims of the study. Reflexivity reflects on how the researcher might have directly impacted the research process and conclusions. So here the researcher must take into account such factors as his or her age, their gender, ethnicity, economic background, and profession, as well as any other relevant personal experiences. This should also be something that's ongoing throughout the process and should be addressed in the research report. Attention to negative cases. This provides evidence that data that seem to contradict conclusions were explored, cases that differed from the norm were sought, and rival explanations for the findings were considered. All right, so this brings us to the end of Chapter 6, Qualitative Research. It is a good method to use when you need more in-depth information.